Alright, so what I've done here is I've created a couple different diagrams to show you guys about what we're going to plan for this bouncing ball. It's very important to do animation planning before you attempt any animation. Now usually we would base this off of some video reference, and we'll get to that part probably in the next lesson, but this is just going to show what it is that we're going to attempt in Maya before we go ahead and attempt it. It's a very bad practice to just animate blindly as you go, because you have no idea where you're going to end up in your performance. You have no idea how long it's going to take. It's not a very organized way to work. Sometimes there's exceptions to that. If you're struck with a sudden inspiration, go ahead and follow that. Why not? But what we're on about is trying to replicate realistic motion, and so we've got to think through that realistic motion while we're beginning here to try to get a grip on what it is that we're going to try to represent. So here's the ultimate animation that we're going to do. We're going to have this bouncing ball bounce a few times, dribble a few times, and roll to a stop ultimately. But before we look at that, let's look at some of the forces that are going to act on our object. So here we've got our ball suspended in air, and there are several forces acting on it. For one, it's going to have gravity acting on it for the entire time that it's visible in our scene, because gravity doesn't really change unless the planet is falling away or something, or we're talking about very, very large objects moving closer and farther away from each other. So gravity is going to be a constant force pulling it down towards the ground. Okay, the ground is not going to change either. It's just going to be a static ground object, solid, and it's going to encounter resistance against the ground, which is going to cause it to bounce off of it and then ultimately roll along it and come to a halt there. So as the gravity is pulling this ball down towards the ground, it's going to fall faster and faster and faster towards the ground. It would reach a terminal velocity at some point, but we're not dealing with anywhere near the size of a fall that you would need to encounter terminal velocity. So for our cases, it's going to go faster and faster and faster towards the ground, meaning that every time it travels downward, we're going to have a ease out from the upper position and a fast in to the ground. Okay, when it hits the ground, it's going to encounter resistance from the ground. The ground is not going to be compressible in this case, but the ball is compressible. The ball is going to be filled with rubber or air, so it's going to be compressible, and it's going to push against it, have force stored up inside of it, and then it's going to push itself back off as it recoils back up into the air. So it's going to go fast into the ground and fast out of the ground, but whatever force it has pushing it up into the air is going to dissipate as gravity continues to act on it. So it's going to push up into the air, slow down, slow down, slow down, and then start to fall again back down towards the ground. So every apex of the bounce is going to be an ease in, going up, and an ease out, coming back down. Okay, sideways, we've also going to have some forces acting on it. We're going to have some initiating force. We don't know what that is. Let's just assume that someone threw the ball to the side. So that initiating force is going to throw the ball to the side. And then we're going to have a couple things that are slowing the ball down from continuing on to the side forever. One is air resistance. So air resistance is going to push against the ball as it's moving through the air medium. It's just going to encounter a little bit of push on the side here, and it's just going to slow it down a little bit at a time until it will finally come to a halt. Also, we're going to have the friction of the ground and the rolling friction of the ground. So every time it touches the ground, the two surfaces interact, and it causes it to lose a little bit of its inertia, which is going to slow it down even more quickly than the air resistance would. So all of those things combined mean that its sideways traveling motion will start fastest and end slowest, meaning that the entire animation is going to be one long ease in to its final resting position way over on the right hand side. Okay? By the way, if you're interested in physics in a more robust way, I definitely encourage you to look up physics lectures or to take a class in physics. For animation, you don't have to understand necessarily the mathematics of physics. You just need to have a basic understanding of physical forces and how they work, and just sort of an intuitive grasp of how things move in the real world. And we can fix a lot of those guesses that you might have to make by looking at reference from the real world, and also about just doing a little bit of study about what these forces are and how they work. But this is all we really need to understand for this modeled motion here. Down here at the bottom, I've got a diagram of what's going to happen. So I'm starting the ball up in midair, and I'm starting it already in motion, so whoever threw it has already thrown it. And I'm even going to say that it had already bounced once in the past, so we're going to start it in the middle of a bounce here. Okay? So it's going to be traveling in this direction over and to the right, and it's going to be hitting the ground, bouncing along. Let's see, so that's a half a bounce, so 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to have 4, 5, 6, 7 as these little dribbles here, which I've just modeled to show that they're single frame movements up and down. And then from frame 42 to 60, we're going to have it roll to a stop here. Now I'm just making these frame numbers based on experience and guesses, and really all I'm trying to do is create a ratio which makes sense. So a diminishing ratio, so that it shows that it had more energy at the beginning and less energy at the end. This is based off of me already having done a lot of different bouncing ball exercises in various different ways. And so what we're doing is we're really just modeling motion at this point. We're not basing it off something real. We'll do that next time so that it's much more robust. Okay? So the diminishing ratio means this is the height of the ball when it started and fell to the ground. Then we should have some proportion of that height given over to the next bounce. And depending on how elastic and how bouncy the ball is, it's going to be a larger ratio or a smaller ratio. So if this was a flat ball, it would be way down here, or if it was something relatively non-elastic or incompressible, it might be way down here as well. Okay, so this is like maybe a tennis ball or basketball, who knows at this point, but it's going to return just a little bit above halfway, it looks like. Actually, I should probably reduce that so that our ball comes to a stop earlier. But it might be exactly halfway. Who knows? I just drew it like this, so we can make that decision. Let's say down here, probably. So it's like 2/3 and then 1/3 as the returning bounce, which would stop it from bouncing really, really quickly. So it returns back, and we want to keep that relationship as we make these estimates of this diminishing return of this bouncing ball. So whatever the ratio is that we establish, we're going to try to make it maintain the exact same ratio, so that what we get is hopefully a little diminishing bounce that looks like this. So our first bounce would be up here, our second, our third, our fourth, etc., etc., and then it gets down to a flat rolling position at the very end. Okay, our keyframes are following a sort of halving ratio as well. So this first half a bounce takes 12 frames, which means that the first total bounce would have taken 24 frames, or 1 second. So from 12 to the next bounce over here, for our entire second bounce, it's only taking 12 frames instead of 24, so it's half of the amount of time. And then I just divided that in half again, so 6 frames between these points, and then 4, because the math was just a little bit easier to do that way. And then all of these take just 2 frames in between each dribble, because that's the minimum that we can get and still have a bounce represented. And then finally it's going to settle down and just roll to a stop in the last, 18 frames, so a little bit more than half a second. So we have this nice time to stop here. So we want to make sure that we know in advance what the motions are going to be modeling. Sideways motion, as we talked about up there, is one long ease in. So it's going to go fastest sideways at the beginning and slowest sideways at the very end when it comes to a halt. And if we were doing a really nice job of this, we might have it roll and roll back a little bit. We're just going to model this as a sort of diagram in this case. Vertically, it's going to be fighting gravity and its own elasticity. So every fall will be an acceleration, so ease out from the top position. Then it's going to bounce and suddenly return back up to the top. So we're going to have an ease in. So each change in direction at the bottom will be very quick, and each change in direction at the top will be very slow. And that should be propagated out through all of these different bounces. Okay? Armed with this knowledge of where our frames are going to go and approximately the positions in this diagram, we can go ahead and attempt our beginnings of this bouncing ball exercise.